get back to work. Everybody here? Go ahead, let's move on.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. I think there was good discussion this morning. We do have some other items that, so we do need to continue this discussion. We can move them, I suspect, a little more rapidly than we did this morning, but maybe not, since it's always a little easier to keep moving than it is to start something. So let's go on to let me ask first, are there any other questions, issues, comments related to the administration, key issues or considerations? Okay.
Can I just make a comment? On the last one about the repository website, I think at the Transition Task Force, what we talked about with everything being in a cloud is that every jurisdiction would have access to the totality of documents. And so you're just looking someplace to archive originals.
So
do we have my question is, where does anybody archive things these days?
Well,
Andre's leaving the table, but
the library. Do they have a library that does that? That might be the thing. But I'm just trying to
CSUMB library.
Say that, the Transition Task Force was saying this is not insurmountable either, that all of us would be able to access it. So I would like to take that one off and quit worrying about it.
You're right.
Like success.
The cloud is an option. We anticipate the website, the FORA website could actually be continued in existence. But there are some documents that are not on that website that are historical and archived documents. Those are the ones that, at least at this point, I'm thinking we're going to be buying a 6 terabyte hard drive. Here you are, City of Marina, here's your copy of the documents, and doing that for every jurisdiction. It's probably less than $1,000 to do it that way. But anyway, that's kind of what staff is thinking.
Ms. Garfield.
Yeah, but if something goes wrong, who are you going to call?
Ghostbusters.
I mean, you call Ghostbusters, see how it works, but it's true, is you still need an administrative go-to. If other information needed to be added, or if there's a corruption of data, or it may not be, it may be nominal, it may be insignificant, it may never happen, but you still need to have who's in charge of that cloud. You can't just throw it to the cloud and it never to be seen again, because it might never be seen again.
But with a hard drive, if I got a hard drive as a city, I would make a backup of it. I would make sure I could open it when she gave it to me. And if I know the documents are stored at Andre's library, that I know that if I can't read page 45, I can go to his library and look at the document. Yes.
Well, it probably would also be at City of Marina Library, actually.
But that's exactly my point, is that you need to know who you're going to go to should you need to.
Yeah.
But just to put it in the cloud and be done with it isn't the end of the story.
So can we put it at the National Archives? That's something I would look at. No, the National Archives have many things.
So from a staff level, there was just a question of if folks, there's every possibility that we could, for what would be a relatively small cost, be able to provide a pretty significant hard drive to every jurisdiction that needed it. I don't know what we do in terms of requests for certified copies of things post-2020. You guys who are ESQs know about that. But those were the questions, is how do you manage those kinds of requests? And we'll address it by, we'll put a proposal together of that, take it off for the board and make it a staff assignment.
Feels like movement.
Okay, any other comments on this section? Let's move on then to environmental services. Sherry, did you want to present some information?
Pretty easy. Environmental services, here are your key issues and your key questions. I'm not going to go reiterate them, but it's who's the successor. We talked a little bit about that earlier today. How do we share resources and responsibilities if it turns out that we're not covered by either an insurance policy or there's some catastrophic issue that's not covered? We've talked a little bit about that. I don't think there's anything new. and now I'm turning it back to you for discussion.
Okay, comments? This morning we talked about liability insurance, or touched on that, and a continuation of how do we manage that in the future. Other comments? Mr. Edelin?
Yeah, I think being on the transition task force, this is the easiest one. And I think if I speak for most people, I think we have a consensus. There will be some sort of a follow-on agency that will manage ESCA. I don't think that's controversial at all. It's just a matter of fact, where will it be located? Who will be responsible for it primarily? So once we designate that, that's one thing I think we can get quick agreement on.
So as a reminder, if there is a follow-on agency like a JPA or something else in terms of transition plan, we need to actually have that entity in existence when LAFCO approves the plan so that we can designate that entity as the successor entity. There are also a series of requirements that we have to go to EPA and to DTSC, the regulators, and the Army to make sure that everybody is in accord and that that entity can succeed to the obligations.
Ms. Parker?
Thank you. So, question, I thought I heard earlier that the county was named as the successor entity. So is that in question, or, I mean, are we making this more complicated than it needs to be, or is that something where Seaside Marina, the county, Delray Oaks, people who have buildings and land where there needs to be monitoring and follow-up and so on, should they get together and say, who's going to be it and how are we going to do it?
Right. So the answer to that is, you did hear the county, and the county is one of the potential successor entities, but under the Environmental Services Contract Agreement, which provided the initial funding, there was thought given to who a successor might be for purposes of this part of the ESCA process, and that was defined as the City of Seaside, the City of Marina, the County of Monterey, or a JPA of some or all of those entities, or even other entities as well could be a part of that JPA. But those are your four choices under the Environmental Services contract.
Mr. Hulamar?
Yes, Supervisor, you're correct. What you'd heard earlier, I think, though, relates to the insurance contract. There are multiple things that have to do with environmental services, and just really quickly, because I think all the board members will benefit from a very brief comment here. The Environmental Services Cooperative Agreement and the work associated with monitoring the properties that we worked on under that agreement have money associated with continued monitoring and reporting for those properties. We also have a pollution legal liability contract that started 2015, ends in 2025, that we used some of our ESCA dollars to pay for ongoing coverage for things that happen or might accrue or liability on those same properties and actually others, because we expanded it beyond that. Third, there's an agreement in place where the county provides reporting to the California Department of Toxic Substances Control on munitions, on contaminants, and other issues related to land use covenants on the former Fort Ord that are both these properties and others. And the funding for that is reimbursed by each jurisdiction to the county under an agreement. So there are three different pieces, and sometimes they get confused.
Thank you. Ms. Morton?
So to that point is the county has already stepped up contractually for some items. And so to your earlier question this morning, you just repeated it. It would be beneficial for the other jurisdictions sitting around this table to know that the county understands what they're already contractually obligated to do, what the balance of the contractual obligations that we would like, perhaps Marina would like you to step up and do. But the key component here is that the contract is assignable. The terms of the contract specifically state it's assignable. So there's not hurdles that we have to overcome. It's just we need to know who we want to assign it to And so if your Board of Supervisors needs to make that decision, we look forward to it.
Thank you. And I think too, I mean, the Board of Supervisors can make a decision, but often staff talks to each other beforehand and talks, kind of talks about, well, what are you doing? What are you willing? What do you need? They work that out and they make a recommendation to us. So I'm thinking that on a few of these, to have the staff talking to each other, seeing where the options are, and then getting a kind of an agreement from the elected officials, a nod, and then we know what we're up to. Yeah.
Other comments? You want to move on to the next item? Sherry, is there anything else in terms of information that FORA may need to keep moving forward on recommendations to the FORA board? Are there any other issues that you need to have covered right now on the habitat?
On the ESCA, no, not on ESCA. We're going to talk about habitat, so I'm going to move on to the next topic, if that's okay. Habitat, here are your key issues. And we talked about this generically and kind of specifically actually earlier on what happens if there's not a base-wide habitat conservation plan. We've been planning that for quite some time. This poses those similar kinds of questions. It also poses the question of if there is no habitat cooperative, i.e. JPA, formed to manage the habitat, who then is the successor if we are successful in getting a base-wide habitat conservation plan or a base-wide 2081 permit? Who is the successor for purposes of that if there's no JPA? But it's my understanding that many of the jurisdictions around the table that have habitat obligations are looking at that JPA document. I know Forest staff was working very diligently to incorporate some changes, suggestions by your various jurisdictions. So I'm hoping that that is going forward expeditiously. How are replacement funds allocated? So this is a little less, it's addressed if you have a habitat conservation plan, a JPA, and the implementation plan in play because it addresses these issues. But if you don't, you need to address how we're going to continue to fund that, or if we're going to go with the last option, which is one that we suggested, Plan B, taking the monies on hand at the end of sunset, putting those into some kind of a trust or distributing them for habitat, base-wide habitat obligations that would be managed on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis. That's all I have.
Okay.
Over to you.
Mr. Albert.
Thank you. Even though I'm sure most of the people in here have an answer to my question, but that's what happens when you're a third stringer coming in later. But my question is that the habitat conservation plan, if it isn't a JPA, how do you know if those plans are consistent throughout the jurisdictions? That's just a question I was wondering. How would you know if one city or one jurisdiction would see their habitat conservation plan as similar to somebody else's? I think that question has to be answered.
Thank you.
Not now.
It's like almost everything, it's complicated, but in the nuclear option, if there's no base-wide habitat conservation plan in each individual jurisdiction, we're responsible for developing its own habitat conservation plan, which quite frankly, they've been done on a project-by-project basis already across the base. So East Garrison has its own plan in play, as does Marina Heights. So there are already projects that have their own individual habitat conservation plans in place. Those are reviewed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, by the federal agencies, and the federal agencies are required by law to review those. So in that instance where you have multiple ones, it's up to Fish and Wildlife to make sure that they have a certain amount of consistency for their purposes and protections from their hat.
I figured there'd be an answer.
Okay, Ms. Morton?
So the question that keeps coming up for me is there any way to lower the financial cost for this obligation? in other words, is any of what we're taking on as a FORA board in anticipation we were going to have this tremendous build-out discretionary versus what's mandatory? So have we really looked at it to say, how can we modify or change what our obligation is to meet the state law, the criteria of what everybody's asking for? That would be one question. You raised this earlier. And the other thing is that the transition plan, can our transition plan not state that provided we have this treated as one footprint, is that this is what's going to happen? But if by June 2020 we can't accomplish that, or the board has decided that there's something better, is that here's the alternative, that these funds would be allocated back pro rata share. So if I gave $6,600 Marina for 100 homes, I would get back that money to fulfill the next function. So can we address that in the transition plan? But more importantly, between now and next week or the next month, is can we address what the habitat management needs to be and really hone into that?
So from a work plan standpoint, the FORA work plan is to bring to this board in August of this year the status update on the HCP and where it is in the overall planning process, if it's ready for public release, but it's going to be an update. And I think that is where we're going to be hearing a lot of what you are talking about, and whether or not the return of funds should be on a pro rata share, or whether or not we should continue as board policy to consider habitat and the monies that we've collected on a basis as a base-wide obligation. That would be a little inconsistent with returning on a pro rata share, but it would be consistent with the base-wide integrated management, which would be the Plan B option.
So in that status, when it comes in August, I think what City of Marina would like to see is also, it's not just an update, but an exploration under the law of what would be alternatives available to us to meet our commitments that we have to do by law versus what this plan was. And they may be identical. And when I say restore on a pro rata basis, if in fact you have a portion that's already, that is going to be base-wide, that it's 30% is base-wide because that's what exists as of 2020. And I'm saying pro rata based on not only contribution, but what percentage of the responsibility stays with FORA versus what percentage goes back to the jurisdictions. So I want to make that clear.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Parker?
Thank you. I think we've talked about the habitat management being something that is done by a separate JPA. I think we've always said that that's what we would do. So it sounds, my question was going to be, when do we think such a JPA might be able to be formed? So it sounds like conversations are happening with the jurisdictions. Do you have any sense for when the more or less agreed upon document might be being accepted by jurisdictions and then the JPA be able to be formed? Are we talking about later this year, early next year?
Well, we are ever hopeful that it's this year. I think FORA staff has worked very diligently to amend the documents and worked very closely with the jurisdictional staff stakeholders who have been at the table, including county council and the other attorneys who have been at the table. And it was my understanding that actually the ball has been turned back into the jurisdictions, that we are at the final, I'm going to say final in quotes, but that JPA was always anticipated to be adopted at or about the same time as a base-wide HCP. It was anticipated as part of a comprehensive package. So to the extent that there needs to be some, I'm going to call it a wiggle amendment, not a legal term, but basically to cover the contingency that the HCP, that you're establishing an organization that may or may not have an HCP purpose. It still could be formed for purposes of long-term habitat management if that's what you chose to do, because you're setting up the JPA in anticipation of a base-wide habitat conservation plan. So we're hopeful for this year.
Thank you. Yeah, it seems to me that forming a JPA is a good step, and then if the HCP comes to be relatively soon, fine, but if not, then that JPA could be the entity that decides, do we keep trying for that base-wide HCP, or do we take the habitat management plan that we already have that parcels out obligations to the various jurisdictions, and do we sort of oversee that and let that be our standard? And what does that mean in terms of the financial commitments? But the JPA can take those decisions forward.
Other comments, Mr. Edelin?
What Supervisor Parker says makes sense. Okay, I'm not debating that. I'm not debating that. No, except. No. I know. No, except again, once we start piecemealing out the responsibilities of FORA, okay, we start losing the cohesiveness of everybody working together towards an end. Right now we have the base reuse plan, everybody's working together to get all these things done, and I appreciate that. And we may end up with ESCA piecemealing it out, we may end up with HCP piecing it, but once we start doing that, we're no longer cohesive, then it becomes a zero-sum game, and it's every man for himself, and we're not going to have that that unity of purpose to get this thing done. So I'm just putting not a warning, but just think about that. We're either going to, there's a possibility that the senator may end up trying to push the FORA Act into the future where we're still working together towards each one of these responsibilities, or maybe we can't do that and we may end up going with the JPA and the ESCA and all these other things. But if we go that route, it's going to get very difficult and probably pretty nasty, because it'll be a zero-sum game and we're all going to be fighting for our own share.
Thank you. Ms. Morton?
Yes, so the difference about ESCA, the difference about creating extensions of FORA, et cetera, the habitat management is an obligation in perpetuity that was always designed to create, for FORA to create the funding for an endowment that generated money, for this to be protected into the future 100 years from now. Maybe not, because there's a rule against perpetuities, but for a very long period of time, longer than the existence of FORA. So from that standard, when this was the decision made a decade ago, before I was here, or however long ago it was the idea was the JPA was your representation, my representation, county representation, is that it is still an entity that has oversight, but it's coming with the funding. This organization was responsible for the creation of the plan and the funding. They were not made or ever anticipated to be responsible for the oversight forever. So that's why, to Director Parker's comment about getting the agreement done, making sure right now, as a collective board, while we're all sitting here, that the content and the interest of Delray Oaks are protected is why we need to do it today. But going forward, your city will always have, if you're a member, always have a voice.
Understand what you're saying is correct, but again, it's tied in the funding. We're still, $20 million short of the HCP. That funding is going to be tied into what happens with this board. Either the board works together to bring that money through CFD or whatever else, or again, it's every man for himself. We're short. The money has to be raised somehow, and the JPA can't do it on its own. It has no funding capability.
I think we...
Mr. O'Connell, did you have a question, comment? Okay. So, so let me ask again before we move off of the habitat question. I I think we were touching on item 3. Is there any further comment, discussion on item 3? Okay, thank you. We're now at a point for public comment. Are there any comments that any members of the public would like to make on the items that we've discussed thus far, which are the key issues, the administrative, the environmental services, the habitat, and we also talked on the building removal. So if public has any comments, I would ask that to the extent possible, if you can keep your comments very concise, 2 to 3 minutes, that would be very helpful.
I've got a gene pool that has 3 minutes in it. So I'm kind of used to this. I just have a couple of thoughts just in terms of the kinds of discussions and the kinds of presentations that you get that leave you with questions without necessarily leaving you with a direction. And it seems to me there are a number of priorities that have already been established here today or discussed, but I don't see a consensus. I don't see an attempt to find out what is the highest priority. I don't see an attempt to do that. And it seems to me that those that have to write the plan, those that have to plan ahead on staffing requirements, those that have to plan ahead on where the money's going to go, where the budget's going to go, where the CIP is going to go, that you're leaving things on the table that could be moved forward and off the table. And I've just like the discussion just now about HCP and ESCA. You could make a decision today or very, very soon. Let's move that issue off the table and get it into the transition plan so that you don't have to deal with it anymore. Even if there are unresolved issues with that coming down the road, those jurisdictions and those members of the JPA will work them out because they're not going to tolerate something that's not working very well either, and they will make the changes. But it doesn't have to be FORA that is leading the change on every issue that's in the transition plan. The agencies, and particularly the land use jurisdictions, really have the obligation and the responsibility and the risk of going forward, not FORA. And I think, and going to Mayor Elam and the comment about this cohesiveness and working together and so on, it seems to me that those comments are not recognizing what the existing law says. You will terminate. If you can just put that into your brain and say, what do we need to do to kind of move this whole organization away or shrink it substantially? If you can't get that, if you can't get your brain around that, then you're always going to have problems. You're always going to have reasons why you should stay in existence. I just say you need to just make a mental statement to yourself. How do we terminate? What can we move? What can we move sooner rather than later? What's left over to that really requires some wrestling? And then wrestle with it. I just think you can move forward quicker than you are. And I just think the public, LAFCO, and others, and all the jurisdictions will benefit as you move items off the table and you start wrestling with the higher priority issues. I just hope I see that. Thank you.
Thank you. Other public comments?
Hello, my name is John Wizard. I'm a Seaside resident. And the thing that struck me was if we are to assume that FORA does not exist, there is no cohesion. There is no teamwork. There is no mandate to be regional because the regional body is not here. So while we should plan for regional interoperability, while we should plan for partnerships and cooperation, those things are going to be shifted to individual actors to take up on their own accord. So things that can be fixed today, or at least moved forward, like a potential JPA for ESCA, I think that could potentially be one point where the people of this body and the cities and the county are able to find some cohesion post-FORA, assuming that's what happens, because we're here today to discuss the transition of FORA. So if we talk about what happens if FORA doesn't exist, one way that we might all still keep that skin in the game and still be beholden to one another's best interests and using the land responsibly is to force us into a room on this issue by having a JPA where we all have input and liability. So I'm in favor of the FORA board moving forward on a JPA for the ESCA solely because it's one way to stay regional, it's one way to stay accountable to one another, and it does accomplish that regional cohesion, assuming FORA doesn't exist anymore. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Dawn Alva. I'm a resident, a marina, and business owner. My comments will be pretty brief because City Manager for Seaside did a great job in the letter, and I want to echo the priorities of updating the base reuse plan or determining what the legalities are around with FORA is gone, removing blight and hastening the empowerment of the land use jurisdictions. I am optimistic. This is the first time I have attended one of these board meetings and or working sessions that it feels like we're having conversations to move forward. So I appreciate the work that everybody's done all the years, and I'm optimistic that we will have opportunity or options on the table quickly that will benefit the region as well as my city of Marina, which has a pretty big obligation. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Okay. We have 25 minutes before we're scheduled to not meet any longer, and the FORA board has a 2 o'clock meeting. So let's move through. We have 3 more items. Let's move through them, and again, be maybe a little more concise in comments at this point. Sherry, Ms. Damon, would you present slides on the topics of transportation, wastewater, water, and miscellaneous?
All right, transportation, it's a thing. We almost all drive, take a bus, planes, trains, automobiles, bicycles. I just wanted to remind everybody about what we're talking about in terms of the capital improvement program. And I do know that TAMSI's regional part of the capital improvement program is not shown on here because I think there was an assumption that that would be assigned back. TAMSI is the lead agency already on all of those regional projects. Remember, the FORA capital improvement program is a revenue generation program. It takes revenues that are generated from the development and collection of CFD fees here at FORA, and it transmits those to other lead agencies. The yellow highlights are the projects that FORA is the build obligation of FORA. So if FORA does not complete the build prior to 2020 or on sunset, those are obligations, build obligations that would need to occur as part of the transition plan if everybody is on the same page with respect to finishing the obligations, that these are the obligations of the transition plan. Put back this slide. This is the on-site, off-site roads only, not the MST, not the regional, just your on and off-site roads and how it looks in terms of dollars by jurisdiction. You can see the county gets a hefty amount of on and off-site roads as lead agency and as the proposed assigned agency. If the FORA CFD were to continue, actually through 2020, the county is scheduled to receive about $4 million toward those road obligations that are within the county lands, but that still leaves a huge gap after 2020. So if your FORA CFD goes away, that is the revenue sharing piece that we've been talking about. How do we share the revenues to get that addressed? The CFD column post 2020, this is if your CFD continued, how many funds would be collected by jurisdiction. You can see the main collection of entitled development comes from and fees come from the City of Marina. So City of Marina would most likely be doing revenue sharing with the entity that is doing the roads. That would be county, the biggest chunk. So I would anticipate, and in fact, we heard the City of Marina representative, one of them, say that at least one of their developers is going to be paying a fee and then sending that check over to the county for those road obligations that it's putting in play. What was silent, though, in that is the prioritization piece of it. When does the City of Marina transmit those fees? Does it do it on a permit by permit basis? Does it do it as the FORA program does, which is on a reimbursement basis? Still some questions, I think, on that, but this is what it looks like. Next slide. Here are your key issues: who completes the build requirements of FORA, and what is the timing of those? That's your big picture build issue. And then what's the schedule for the rest of the network completion? That is on a jurisdiction by jurisdiction basis, since we have other lead agencies. FORA is just generating revenues for a part of those roads. So we don't pay 100% of Davis Road. We pay 12 million, but the anticipated cost by the county projections is 60 million or more. So the county and the county's revenues are generating those, the bulk of those revenues. The FORA program just generates a piece of revenue for those. How do we ensure the network is completed and the forward ORD zone obligations are monitored and reassessed as necessary? And how do you handle cost overruns if you find an unexploded ordinance in a place where you hopefully didn't expect it, or hopefully expected it, and you have a construction plan in place? Those are your key issues on transportation. Do you want me to keep going? All right. Water, wastewater. Nothing new. These are the key issues. All of these key issues in this discussion is a carryover from the June 8th presentation. Nothing new in terms of the questions. What now is just the time for more thorough and engaged discussion amongst the parties. So you have some water issues, and we heard Marina Coast last time and repeatedly saying that they have a way to capture the funding, so they are prepared to step up to the plate if FORA's capital facility, community facilities district fee goes away and $17 million for augmented water goes away. They are prepared to adopt their own fee to and impose that on every builder on the base for that still it needs to pull a permit. So I don't think we need too much of that. Those considerations are the same as we outlined before about annexation. How do we make sure and assure fair and equitable water supply across the base, including future annexations and delivery of water to those entities and areas that aren't annexed now? How do we assure there's adequate representation and that other folks have a say in how much they're being charged for water, service, et cetera, and participate in that decision-making process? Miscellaneous contracts. This has to do with monitoring settlement agreements. So FORA has a series of settlement agreements. The Sierra Club settlement agreement is the primary one, but there are also writ compliance issues. So FORA is the beneficiary of a writ against the California State University, which has certain requirements and obligations that have to be met there. Marina, most likely, will be the responsible entity for writ compliance as to CSUMB, since they were also a party to that litigation. But the Sierra Club agreement didn't have the same kind of a structure, so who monitors and can looks at that? Who pays litigation attorney's fees and costs awarded subsequent to June 30th, 2020? And we talked a little bit, I think, generically about that in terms of a litigation defense fund, possibly to figure out how that might work. Or just when FORA goes away, your ability to collect goes away. Sorry, folks, that's it. What happens to pending litigation post-2020? We talked a little about that. And who manages pending litigation post-2020? Same considerations. And then we already talked about building removal. And I just want to add here for the public transition comments. I'm hopeful as we move forward, we said this at the last meeting, but that comments come in through the planning@fora.org. It's easier for staff to actually respond in a comprehensive, cohesive way when it has comments in writing. I'm taking notes. We've got video, but that is a good primary source of way to get information to FORA staff on questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, agreements that have been reached, etc. And I believe that concludes my part of the presentation.
Okay. So we have roughly 10 minutes because I want to leave an opportunity for the public to comment at the very end. Mr. Moore?
So if you could go back, please, to slide 26, I'd just like to give the board a couple of updates on some of these questions. The first question was, how do you provide for public representation if no annexation prior to 2020? We hope by August or September of this year that Marina Coast will have and approve for delivery to the various land use jurisdictions a model service agreement that would cover this issue. And we don't anticipate that LAFCO will be unable to take action before 2020, but in the off chance that they do, the answer to this question is the representation would be through the city councils, the land use jurisdictions, county board of supervisors, and those service agreements. So that's an update on question one. On question two, the most important thing for the FORA board to do prior to 2020 is to finalize the final sub-allocation of the 970 odd acre feet of remaining water in that obligation. That needs to get done between the land use jurisdictions. Marina Coast isn't doing that. That's on you all, and I urge you to move forward quickly with whatever fights, mud fights, food fights, whatever, to get that accomplished. With respect to question number three, how will we pay for augmented water? That is going to be through capacity charges and rates. With respect to number four, I'm afraid there's no guarantees, there's no absolute ensuring that future annexations for the Ord community, because they all require LAFCO approval, and unless Chair Rubio can somehow guarantee that he can deliver the votes to make that happen on the LAFCO board, it's up to LAFCO. I will comment, the question is maybe a little bit confusing as to what Ord community means, because LAFCO has already said we're not interested in having Marina Coast annex the national monument because there's no service out there. There's no anticipated future development. So does Ord community mean literally the boundaries of the former Fort Ord, or just some subset? And if so, what is that subset? That might require some clarification in that particular question. And then with respect to question five, essentially we already do that latter thing, sharing these water supply charges across the base, because it doesn't matter whether it's relatively inexpensive to expand capacity in the dunes area because it's near the wells and near the main existing infrastructure, versus extending infrastructure to Delray Oaks' proposed developments. You know, it's going to be much more expensive to do that than it was for the dunes, but the capacity charge is the same across the base. So effectively, we're already doing that. And then if you go to the next slide, real quick, number four, I don't know that you can require Marina Coast to annex, because that goes back to the LAFCO question that we'd be happy to annex anyone we serve. That's just the right thing to do. Let me see if there's anything else here. Okay, that's all my comments on updates. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, Ms. Parker, then Ms. Morton.
Thank you. I had a couple questions kind of based on perusing the larger print, which then told me where to go to push on the link. So under the county, under miscellaneous, there's the contract between East Garrison, the county, and FORA. I think it's the first thing under miscellaneous. Can you explain what revenue FORA is expecting to receive from that the East Garrison project under that contract, and are you trying to assign any revenue to, if you're anticipating some?
I think you're referring to the East Garrison development deal. So FORA the county structured the deal with the developer that FORA would get paid in participation payments at the end of that program. So what came to the FORA board, I think, was in the range of $20 million to FORA in participation payments. So in terms of who the beneficiary is, I assume it would be the county if there's no FORA.
Thank you. And then it looked as though there were some implementation agreements included, but maybe not all. I guess I'm wondering, is that true, or am I just missing it? So how did you decide which ones to list? And then also, if you could clarify what revenue sources the implementation agreements cover, because I thought it was land use proceeds, but it looked like maybe there might be some development fees being considered. I'm
Right.
not sure. Thanks.
All right. So with respect to the implementation agreement, revenue sources, it's land sales release proceeds, and it's development fee or CFD fee, and it's a property tax amount are the three provisions that are in the implementation agreement.
And the first one you said was land use
Or lease proceeds.
Lease proceeds.
Land sales or lease proceeds. And then second question, or one of the questions was why we didn't include implementation. It's just an oversight. This is, I have a new assistant, thank you very much. And these are draft charts, they are works in progress, and she came to me and said, I have a whole category of things that were in the charts that didn't have a assignment column. How are we going to do that? So again, these are working documents. That issue was brought up by your staff a few days ago.
Okay.
And so I've got that in my hopper to make sure that the lists are updated.
Thank you. And okay, so then there was kind of a smaller one that I assume my staff has talked to you about, or will I can talk to you offline. Then
Sure.
Kind of a larger, just general question was about doing CEQA on the transition plan. I know county council at the, at the county has said that she firmly believes that CEQA is required, and so I'm just her concern, our concern is that without doing environmental review on this, that there's that liability for lawsuits and entanglements that could make life worse for FORA and us all. So, is there a plan to do CEQA?
Well, the current analysis is that this is not a project that requires CEQA, and I outlined all the reasons why. This is dealing with assets, liability, pledges, and obligations, which were already analyzed. What this is doing, and this transition plan is doing, is it's changing the organization from one organization, FORA, to 5, 7, 8 organizations, entities that will be implementing what FORA is already doing. So from the project level, I gave 2 reasons why we believed it was not subject even to CEQA at all. But that being said, this would also qualify, and LAFCO routinely processes organizations, changes in organizations using an exemption process. There's a specific exemption that deals with LAFCO situations like this. I'd like to distinguish this from the argument that was raised, or the issue that was raised in the Land Watch letter, that somehow the base reuse plan policies change, or something changes that's going to increase or change the mitigations, or the defined resource plan goes away. That's not what this is. This is a very different situation than adopting a new general plan, or amending a general plan, or even updating the base reuse plan, which undoubtedly would require a huge amount of CEQA analysis. There is no project, no specific plan, nothing, no dirt, no air, nothing changes.
Which sounds to me like an argument for saying that the base reuse plan, the master resolution, all the policies are going forward as they have, that nothing's changing. So, which was an earlier question about whether these things run with the land or however, but if they're binding on future jurisdictions. And right? I mean, isn't that related, or?
It could be related. I mean, if the conclusion is, and each jurisdiction says, you know what, they all go out the window, and we're going to do whatever the heck we want, and we're going to make that known to the organization now, then you might have a possible issue going forward, and maybe some higher level, or in fact, CEQA review would be required at that point in time, but we would need to know your future plans, and they would have to not be speculative. And I think as I sit here today, I haven't heard any jurisdictions say, oh, yes, I plan on putting, 250 houses here, with enough level of specificity and planning to allow FORA from an environmental standpoint to say, oh, yes, this is what I'm going to analyze because this is what's going to happen when FORA goes away.
So is there any level of CEQA review that would essentially take a look at what's happening and say, I don't know, like an initial study or whatever else that would say, oh, we've looked at it from an environmental review perspective, and there's nothing further that needs to be done in terms of mitigations, or which is a form of CEQA review, right? Or is
that is, but again, I guess based on the discussions here today, it sounds like what the transition plan is still a little bit of a moving target. It's pretty difficult to do an initial study on something that's a moving target like that. So if the county and Marina or whoever comes up with an agreement and they say, oh, we've got an agreement, this is what needs to be in the transition plan because we have an agreement, we have a JPA now, and we have a this and we have a that. That's one scenario. Also, to prepare an initial study would be to concede that this is actually a project subject to CEQA. It's not unquestionable. We did include in the budget amounts for CEQA review of this document, but we have run the concept that this is not a project subject to CEQA by our attorneys, by our environmental consultants, and they were comfortable with those conclusions. So that's where we are, and I appreciate County Council's discussion. I do think that's a legal discussion that should be had.
And so it sounds like what you're saying is, unless as part of developing the transition plan any specific changes come forward, you don't think there's any reason to do CEQA review. But if there were some change that were identified as part of putting the transition plan together, at that point, the transition plan with those changes in it might need to have some sort of environmental review.
It might. Although, again, the state legislature was pretty clear about what this transition plan needed to address, and it was fairly limited. Assets, liability, obligations, pledges. Those were the things. It was always intended we would be handing off what we started and what was in play, not intended to create a brand new planning process. It's just handing over what we've already done.
Other comments?
Yeah, you.
Mr. Giffen, did you want to comment? No? Okay. Gail, I'm sorry.
Yes,
Ms.
no,
Morgan.
that's okay. The contracts that run with the land, I think that's something that everybody is struggling with, and it's recorded, but the enforcement mechanisms has already currently fallen on somebody challenging a proposed development, such as Monterey Downs, was challenged at the city council as being inconsistent with the base reuse plan, as not having sufficient water. So that mechanism would remain if it's a covenant running with the land. The other thing is that anybody that's purchased land, like Marina Community Partners, has purchased this land and anticipates that the county land that's adjoining it will fulfill the function that's in the base reuse plan. You're not going to turn something into something else, because that's how they valued their land premise. So they would have standing to sue if somebody was trying to change. I want to go back to the cost that Sherry went through. So we have all of this capital improvement program cost, transportation, water augmentation, habitat management, totals million anticipated as of sunset date 2020. So we've been kicking this around. We're all trying to figure out funding mechanisms. What I want to do is whittle away that number. Today, we are hearing that TAMC is saying that if it takes the regional road obligation, the off-site regional road obligations, and they're going to figure out how to fund that through their own nexus, I want to see the financial impact on that 194.5, if any. Then secondly, Marina Coast Water District is saying that they will handle the generation of what we've earmarked water augmentation as 17.1 million. I'm looking for Marina Coast Water District and whoever needs to sign that agreement, get it done. Let's take that off of the capital improvement program that I need to fund going forward, that we need to start taking off what we can. This was the public's comment, and it seems that that would be appropriate to do, and it lessens the burden of what we have to tackle jurisdictionally. Further, our CFD doesn't cover 194.5 million. It's even full build out, we were at about 116 million. So if we whittle that number down, as a board, can we make decisions about what we're doing?
Okay, and I'm going to ask at this point, we have adjournment listed at 1:30. Am I required to do that? Can we continue a conversation for a few more minutes? What needs to happen here? I'm sorry.
Do not restriction on a study session?
Okay, thank you. So, any other comments on the the three issues that we've just been discussing, either transportation, water, wastewater, or the miscellaneous? We really didn't touch on the miscellaneous. Comments on miscellaneous? These have to do with who handles monitoring, who handles settlement agreements, who's responsible for future litigation, that kind of thing. Any comments from board members? Mr. Edelin?
Yes, two transition task force, or maybe three ago, we had a briefing that I believe there's 127 separate agreements where FORA is mentioned that we've had over the many years, where they're actual legal agreements that we are responsible for. If the FORA Act is not extended, what the heck do we do with those 127 legal agreements, and how will that impact? I understand we're looking at JPAs and all, and there's good reason for that, but saying we want to do this does not necessarily entail coming up with an agreement or updating those agreements legally. That to me would be a huge burden, I would think.
So I have an answer for that. I think I have an answer for that. As part of the transition plan during the next year, once the FORA board and there is concurrence on who is the proposed successor and an assignee under some of those federal agreements in particular, my thought was that FORA staff would be participating to help transition those to get the appropriate, consents to assignment. It's actually a very legal, paralegal type job, and certainly FORA staff can work with the various cities and city attorneys to make sure that the appropriate documentation gets put in place. I sort of envisioned that as a part of the implementation of the transition plan process as we go forward. So yes, there are a lot of agreements, and thank you for allowing me to have an assistant, funding an assistant to help with some of this stuff, because there is a huge amount of work after we get to what is the final plan what does it look like. Then I turn my attention to the other part. I have a to-do list that you haven't even seen about things that we have to do. Give notice to so-and-so with 120 days, terminate the CalPERS contract. There is a list of to-dos still on the FORA staff list in order to sunset and transition the organization out of existence.
Other comments? All right, I'd like to then open it again to public comment on these items with the same request.
Does that invite a CEQA issue? I think just accelerating a plan shouldn't, but I'm just raising that question.
Thank you.
Candy, I would suggest that the argument would be pretty straightforward. None of this would change or alter any prior environmental reviews, and the financing mechanisms we've been discussing with the administrative committee are all about bringing dollars forward earlier that would remove hazards and issues that we have in the environment today that humans are exposed to. So I can't imagine that there's any CEQA implications.
Any other comments today? I want to thank you all for staying engaged as long as you did. Very much appreciated. I want to also remind you that you have an obligation for a plan by the end of this year. And while we're in July, time is passing very quickly. So I would encourage that if you have additional comments, if you have ideas on what needs to happen next, so that you can assist the FORA staff in getting a draft plan to you, a plan that you need to start reviewing, in my opinion, in September, October at the very latest, that you basically have a month to finish, finish questions, concerns, etc., and have whatever final discussions you need to have so that this can move along, because the responsibility is yours to have this plan in place. End of my lecture, sorry. Ms. Garfield and then Ms. Reimers.
Point noted, thank you. I wanted to see if we could tie up a couple things. I've written down some thoughts that people had that are like, it needs to be settled so other things can be settled. And the ones I have on my list are what commitments run with the land. That I hear that over and over again about what do you know that's going to be cemented into the land, and then you know that it's going to go forward. So that's one. Another one is just confirming that the base reuse plan survives beyond a 2020 sunset. That they're sort of the same thing, but that's confirmed. And then Ms. Morton had asked about two things on that overall responsibilities is what is the impact of Marina Coast Water District's assumption of water augmentation on that $17.1 million amount? So quantifying that so we know what that actual number is. Similarly, TAMC's assumption of regional road responsibilities, how does that impact the $132.3 million that are on that chart? In what way does it change? And the one that just keeps in my head is we're not going to make the money that needs to be done for habitat endowment. What's plan B? And so I think there were some ideas talked about, but I couldn't articulate a solution on that. Does anybody else have any other ones that are like the things we need to know so that we can then know other things? Yeah. So it kind of, one way to look at it as, what are our commitments set in stone that aren't because we decided we wanted to, but things that we may want to do, but we have to do. So, and then how does that survive any potential transition of FORA, whether it's to another GPA or to a distributed one? So those are the ones that I collected from our discussions, and thank you for taking notes on those.
Thank you. Ms. Reimers?
To follow up on that, some notes that I took along that line have to do with, I would like to know more clearly the risk obligations that FORA consistently has signed off on and that has helped the communities, as in the less fees for local landfill commitments and a variety of others that Mr. Hulamein. I would like more of that information so that the jurisdictions and all of us understand more clearly where monies have been saved as a group for the overall communities, rather than just that information as well. And I was pleased to hear that there's interest in a GPA for the habitat, and we've been here a long time for habitat. But so if there's a suggestion for GPA for the habitat, because that's really for the greater good, I would like to extend that one more thought to the larger community, that maybe that is a concept for us all to consider as we look at the details of all of this that we're looking at, because there may be, that's an answer for the entire transition process, to look at the GPA, JPA. Oh, did I say JPA? Excuse me. Thank you.
It's like GPS. Okay, fine. Thank you. It occurs to me that you may want to try to really put priority and focus on this issue right now in each of your jurisdictions and get comments back by the end of July, if at all possible, because that leaves August for a further discussion, for preparing for a board report in August for your board meeting, etc. And then you're up against September, October, right after that. So just a thought. Any other comments from board right now? Any other comments from public? Thank you all very, very much. I'm turning it back over to the chair.
You stand adjourned until 2 o'clock.